What's going on, people? Welcome to We Are Reading. My name is Eli Wananda, and We Are Reading is an ongoing series of live stream discussions where I've been reading various books, articles, essays, and analyzing these texts with a view to kind of getting ideas and inspiration about how we as Black people, as African people around the world, can make a better life for ourselves on a collective level, on an individual level, around in wherever we are domiciled around the world. So we have been reading this really large book called The Blueprint for Black Power by Baba Amos N. Wilson. And the subtitle of the book is A Moral, Political, and Economic Imperative for the 21st Century. So we have got all the way into chapter 13. So that's 200. We're now on page 295, which is pretty good going. We've read a lot of this book, and we've been reading it for about, I think it's around about 6 months now, 7 months, maybe a bit more, since the middle of last year, 2023. So it's been a journey, and I'm happy to continue today with chapter 13. Without further ado, it's a beautiful, lovely, sunny day here in the UK. So thankfully, this chapter is quite a short chapter. That means that once we've finished, I can duck out and check out what's going on in the outside world. So yeah, let's get straight into it. Chapter 13 of Blueprint for Black Power. Now, this chapter is called The Financial Corporate Elite, the New World Government. And this chapter, it's a short chapter, and it's going to be all about some of the themes that we're kind of very familiar with now in 2024, but in 1997, 1998, when this book was published, some of these ideas probably weren't quite so well understood or well established. So yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of digging into this with that historical mindset in mind. And let's get into it. So this the first part of this chapter is called World Ascendancy of Private Capital. So let's talk about this. Ownership is sovereignty. The owners of the means of production, in effect, dominate those people who depend on them for survival and for maintaining and enhancing their quality of life. In capitalist societies, national and multinational corporate hegemons and their satellites markedly influence the quality, rhythms, order, and direction of people's lives. Their self-perception, the nature of their social interactions, their values, tastes, and desires more directly than do their governmental, cultural, and religious institutions, rather. In the face of the organized national and transnational corporate elite, the owners of the means of production, the citizens of supposedly independent nations lose control of over their lives. The masses rapidly lose their power to determine their collective fate directly and indirectly through their elected delegates and heads of state to the owners of vital financial and business capital, to large local, regional, national, and multinational corporations, and to powerful governmental, quasi and non-governmental agencies who represent the interests of the means of production instead of the people. Therefore, the organized business ownership community, the owners and managers of financial capital, the owners and managers of corporations, are self-selected governors who, going beyond certain limits, may surreptitiously usurp the power of representative governments, thereby undermining the power of the people to elect governments which serve their interests before all others, including those of the financial corporate elite. This is page 296 now. When national government's ability to control the national economy and budget is superseded by international trade agreements such as GATT, NAFTA. So GATT, by the way, some of you young cats, GATT is the forerunner of the World Trade Organization. I think the GATT stands for General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, but it was superseded by the World Trade Organization. And NAFTA is a North Atlantic or North American Free Trade Agreement. So superseded by indebtedness to or dependency on international financiers, large foreign national banks, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, various foreign aid arrangements, and the like, all extensions of or related to the machinations of private financial capital, then their national sovereignty or self-determination is essentially an institutional fiction. This is the case with virtually all of the continental African and African diasporan nations today, and an increasing number of nations of all stripes, white, Asian, and Semitic. For example, on June the 20th, 1994, the New York Times reported that through its structural adjustment programs, IMF and the World Bank now effectively oversee and supervise the economies of some 30 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, unquote. Indebted nations are indebted to the owners and managers of public and private financial capital, and to the nations and international agencies who represent them and enforce their contracts. Consequently, these private international financiers, financial institutions, multinational corporations, and multinational government agencies, in conjunction with the hegemonic nations whose domestic and international policies they effectively influence, dictate the economic, social, and political fate of weaker nations against the wills and best interests of their peoples. Increasingly, private financial capital is able to achieve these ends under its own power. So again, this is 1998 that this was being written. This might have seemed kind of esoteric at that point for a lot of people. Even probably people on the left probably might have found this stuff quite, weird and esoteric and unbelievable. But now, nearly 30 years later, this is very common knowledge amongst a large chunk of people. Maybe even the average person in the street probably has a rough idea, particularly when you think of the UK, how with Brexit, and the whole point, one of the drivers of Brexit was that British people wanted to free themselves from what they saw as the shackles of the European Union. And there was some discourse in amongst all the anti-immigrant rhetoric. There was some discourse about sovereignty, national sovereignty, wanting to bring power back to Parliament and the British people and that sort of stuff. So there's definitely much more of an awareness of the power of international institutions and the financial elites and all that sort of stuff these days than there was in the 1990s, I'd say. But carrying on, Felix Rohatyn, it's a strange name, no disrespect to whoever that is, investment banker and former chairman of the Municipal Assistance Corporation for the City of New York, the famous Big Mac, which took control of the city's budget during its financial crisis under the Beam administration, noted this trend, quote, "For the last 50 years, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF have been directly involved in financial economic development in the emerging economies. This role will more and more be taken over by the global capital markets. The cold-blooded selection process by which world capital is invested will determine the economic progress of many developing countries," unquote. Today, the international supremacy of financial capital and the global corporate elite is almost complete. Together, they are colluding to form a new world order, a world government to which all nations will give prostrated obeisance. This is page 297. Do you remember when the New World Order, for you slightly older cats like me, do you remember when the New World Order was like a big, like not meme, this is before memes were really a thing, but when the New World Order was like a big kind of conspiracy theory, the New World Order, New World Order. I think was it George H.W. Bush, who made a speech about the New World Order at some point, and really going into the turn of the 21st century. I remember that New World Order. It was kind of like a catch-all term for globalization, corporatization, corporate takeover, and all this sort of stuff. This is like a little trip down memory lane reading this stuff. So page 297. This fledgling financial corporate world government will not be democratically representative of those it shall govern, though it intends to rule all nations and peoples. It's intended to be a world government dominated primarily by the United States, i.e., white America, the European Economic Community, which is what the European Union was known previously as, and secondarily by Japan, China, and one or two other Southeastern Asian nations. The head of the world government is expected to be the white American financial corporate elite disguised as the democratically elected government of the United States. Its power to rule will be ideologically justified and legitimated in terms of the natural ascendance of private property, private enterprise, privatization, the free market, quote unquote, and US military supremacy. And we're definitely in this state of affairs now, aren't we? You know, when we look at what's going on around the world, the United States, as we talked about in depth last time, I think last time around, or the one before that, the power of the United States is severely curtailed now, and the wars that the United States fights, the military aid the United States gives to nations like Israel and stuff like that is all, you know, it's not determined by the people of the United States. It's determined by the financial corporate elites and interests which dominate the United States government. So page 297, we're now on the private financial corporate complex, United States second government. The fact that a private financial corporate complex and its governing elite are the second government of the United States is evident to all who care to analyze the fundamental social structure of American economic and political power. That is, the elected US government may, for all practical purposes, be perceived as an extension of this private government. Its primary function under such circumstances pardon me. Shout out to my good brother Black Soul DSGB rather. Peace and blessings. Says listening while at work. So yeah, good. Glad to hear that. Hope you don't get in trouble for listening to Blueprint for Black Power while you're doing your work. Shout out to you, my good brother. Peace. Its primary function, that is this government, US government, its primary function under such circumstances is to legitimate and execute private rule by making it appear to be public policy. Thus is the fascist corporate state produced wearing a benign public persona. Thus is the fascist corporate state produced wearing a benign public persona. By the private financial corporate complex, we mean that combination of the largest, wealthiest, and most influential financiers and privately owned financial institutions, syndicates, and corporate bodies, which seek by various methods to influence and direct government policy in favor of its own self-serving interests and often against the best interests of the public. One of the more important means by which this complex influences governmental policy in its favor is through the appointment of some of its most politicized members to head powerful government departments, offices, and agencies. Michael Parenti notes this in his contention that, quote, the top state and federal offices and party leadership positions to this day have remained largely in the hands of white, Protestant, middle-aged, upper-income males of conventional political opinion, drawn from the top ranks of corporate management, from the prominent law and banking firms of Wall Street, and less frequently from the elite universities, foundations, and the scientific establishment. Not every member of the ruling class is born rich, but most are. Not all wealthy persons engaged in ruling. Not all wealthy persons are engaged in ruling. Some preferring to concentrate on making money or living a life of ease. The ruling class contains what could be called the politicized members of its upper class, writes Alan Wolfe. The policies they pursue in office frequently are connected directly to the corporate interests they represent in their private lives. Thus, the decision makers involved in the US armed intervention against the worker-student uprising in the Dominican Republic in 1965 consisted of Abe Fortas, A.A. Burrell Jr., Ellsworth Bunker, Averell Harriman, and half a dozen others who were stakeholders, directors, or counsels for large sugar companies that depended on Dominican sugar and molasses for their profits, for their operations and profits. Even without these direct economic interests, it would be difficult for these gentlemen in their neutral, quote unquote, decision-making roles to escape the assumptions, inclinations, and priorities inculcated by their economic and social milieu, unquote. I hadn't heard about this uprising in Dominican Republic in 1965, so that's something I'll have to look into, actually. In the 5th edition of his book, Parenti further discusses what we refer to as the financial corporate complex. He writes, quote, less than 1% of all corporations control 2/3 of the corporation assets of the entire economy. My goodness me. 49 of the biggest banks hold a controlling interest in the 500 largest corporations. Thus, ITT, Sears, American Express, IBM, Bank America, and Citicorp can all claim JP Morgan Inc. as one of their top investors. JP Morgan is the nation's largest stockholder with more than $15 billion invested in the stock market. In the United States, as in most other industrial countries, financial capital dominates other forms of capital formation, including manufacturing. The trend is towards greater concentrations of corporate wealth as giant companies are bought up by supergiants. Instead of enlarging the economic pie, corporate and financial elites cut bigger slices for themselves. This is why, despite repeated recessions and sluggish economic growth, profits doubled in the early 1990s, unquote. It is certain that the quality of life of the average American citizen is more dependent on the functionality of the corporate sector than on the governmental sector. For it is the corporations and companies which hire and fire, promote and demote, who determine the economic standing and fate of millions of individuals and families. Ain't that the truth? American corporations and companies can, through control of wages, salaries, working conditions, layoffs, job cuts, and much else, more directly affect the social order and quality of life of American citizens than can the American government. It has been decided by constitutional fiat and political tradition that the private financial corporate sector can exercise these vital powers with relatively little interference from the public sector. The cry for less government, deregulation, an unrestricted market economy, or a free market economy, for letting the market determine outcomes by the private financial corporate sector is not a call for full individual freedom of choice and democracy, as it may appear to be on the surface. It cloaks a call for governance by financial corporate authoritarian rule in place of public democratic rule. For where public government does not reign or protect, private government will establish its tyrannies and the private citizen will not be the freer. And that's a really important point for those who maybe are tempted by these right libertarian ideas about, let's get rid of government and then let private individuals agree what they want to do with each other and organize things. It sounds, beautiful and lovely in a sort of idyllic theoretical world where we're just all living in perfect harmony. But the reality is, frankly, the outlets, even some of these podcasters and whatnot, who are pushing some of these narratives about individual liberty and free market and so forth, they're being funded by the Koch brothers and various other of these corporations and companies, because those companies and corporations want to take over our shit. Basically, they want to take over our stuff. They want to be free to do whatever the hell they want to do without silly, pesky, governments getting in the way. This is one of the big narratives of Brexit here in the UK. These British people, largely in the north, poorer part of the country, thought that they were voting, to leave the European Union so that immigration would go down and everyone would get wealthier and it would be great. But really, what's going to happen, if it hasn't even happened already, is that without a lot of those kind of bureaucratic rules in place from the European Union, companies and corporations, particularly American ones, are going to be able to swoop in and take over and run amok. And the Conservatives and Labour and these governments are going to do their bit in enabling them to do so. Whenever you hear someone talking about individual liberty and free trade and free market and stuff like that, be very, very careful, because they are they're either shills, corporate shills, or they're just very ignorant and they haven't yet passed that sort of, you know, that simplistic infatuation with some of these buzzwords. They haven't yet got past that to realize that in the real world, when there's no government in a modern state, when you take government out of the way, when you privatize, it's not millions of individual citizens who club together and we put all our money together and we decide to take over the roads and we take over the water utilities. That's not what happens. When privatization happens, this is what, you know, Africa and South America and other parts of the world were the canaries in the coal mine, because they were doing this crap to us, our homelands, these other countries, back in the 1970s and 80s with the structural adjustment programs. That's what they did. They prevented governments from spending money on healthcare and infrastructure and stuff like that. And basically they forced these governments to borrow money from the financial corporate elites we're reading about here, forced them to borrow money from them to become highly indebted to them in order, you know, and the idea was they were supposed to provide the healthcare and this, that, and the other, but obviously they haven't, because that's not what they're about. There's no profit in keeping people well and healthy. So yeah, that's that. All right, so page 299. Now we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve, private controller of the public economy. The tyranny of the private financial corporate complex over the quality of American life can be no better illustrated by observing the immense influence exercised over the national economy by private financial corporate capital in the form of the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve is self-described as, quote, an efficient monetary mechanism which functions to foster a flow of money and credit that will facilitate orderly economic growth, a stable dollar, and long-run balance in our international payments, unquote. Sounds brilliant. The Federal Reserve, they sound great. Tell me more about this wonderful Federal Reserve that's just here to make everyone happy and healthy and prosperous. Heilbronner and Thoreau describe the Federal Reserve thusly, quote, for many years, the banks themselves decided what reserve ratio constituted a safe proportion of currency to hold against their demand deposits. Today, however, most large banks are members of the Federal Reserve, a central banking system established in 1913 to strengthen the banking activities of the nation. Under the Federal Reserve System, the nation is divided into 12 districts. This is the United States, each with a Federal Reserve Bank owned by the member banks of its district. In turn, the 12 reserve banks are themselves coordinated by a 7-member Federal Reserve Board in Washington. Since the President, with the advice and consent of the Senate, appoints members of the board for 14-year terms, they constitute a body that has been purposely established as an independent monetary authority, unquote. The Federal Reserve is essentially a central bank, and like all central banks, it seeks to exert control over the direction and extent of changes in the money supply. This is page 300. Like all central banks, it seeks to supply the national economy with the right, quote unquote, amount of money through inflating or deflating the money supply by manipulating bank reserves, interest rates, and the buying and selling of US government bonds on the open market. Despite the fact that it may, independent of government interference, have a major impact on the national economy, and for better or worse, on the lives of American citizens, the Federal Reserve is not a public governmental agency. It is not democratically controlled by the people to whose lives it is of crucial importance. For it is an independent private organization owned by its member banks, and like any other privately owned and operated institution, its employees are not civil servants. Referring to this privately owned system, which controls the nation's supply of issue of money and commands its financial resources, Wright Patman, former chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, is reported to have said, quote, in the United States today, we have in effect 2 governments. We have an independent, uncontrolled, and uncoordinated government in the Federal Reserve System, operating the money powers which are reserved to Congress by the Constitution. And this this financial stuff, this economic stuff is so critical. It's one of those areas I think that people on the left and the right really ought to have a lot more common ground on and a lot more common discourse over, because this is kind of like where the rubber hits the road with regard to oppression and you know, the powers that be ruining people's lives. Because what was it? Was it one of the Rothschilds was said to have stated at one point that give me the power to control money supply, and I don't care who's in government, basically. Because if you have control over money, if you have a monopoly over money, which is what came about, I think in 1913 possibly, was when or some point where the dollar became the only legal currency, and then it's control over that is given to a particular private entity like the Federal Reserve, then that gives them the power to plunge people into poverty virtually overnight by devaluating the currency. Debt is another one. I know a lot of people on the left, for some reason, are so anti-Bitcoin. They're really against Bitcoin. They see Bitcoin as like some kind of Ponzi scheme that is just here it's just some scam, basically, right-wing scam. But actually, if you start listening to the more serious amongst the Bitcoin crowd, you'll see that what they're attempting to get at, they're attempting to educate people about the fact that fiat currency is indeed the lever for control over our lives. So it's a shame. It's disappointing for me that so few people I've ever come across on the left are even interested in stuff like this. The Federal Reserve, what are they? What do they do? Money, what is money? Why is it that we're only allowed to spend a particular one form of currency in a particular nation state? What about debt? What about inflation? What about devaluation? What about all this sort of stuff? It's like, I feel like it's almost like people on the left think that politics is just power, or power is just about politics. It's just about governmental, I want to get people into position, into administrative power and that sort of stuff. And this is why they get so excited. Even a lot of people get so excited over, oh, look at this new person who's coming to power in this particular country. Isn't this great? This person aligns with our politics. It's like, guys, the money markets will make or break this person. It's very, very hard for a leader or a party or whatever to go against the corporate elite, because they'll squeeze them either through financial means, or worse comes to worse, if that's going to take too long, they'll just invade. And the United States is no different in that regards to any other country. It's just that the people in the United States have been kind of hoodwinked into thinking that they have some sort of special power and privilege and status. Yeah, they are. I mean, GDP per capita is higher in America, so they're probably richer than, say, people in Chad, for sure. But people in Chad probably have more sovereignty over their lives than people in the United States, And then, I'm very into science and health and stuff like that. If we look at the health of people in the United States, I was talking, one of my videos coming up soon, my Pan-African Science podcast, we're going to talk about heart disease and cardiovascular disease. And the rates of that in the West are skyrocketing. Obesity, all these sorts of things. Why? Check out something called the fiat food system, or how the fiat system destroyed the food health, or something like that. You'll see the interconnection between science and health and food and finances and politics. It's all interconnected, So anyway, tangent over. The point is that the Federal Reserve Bank is a private entity which controls the money supply in America. And because it controls the money supply in America, it is essentially, as Baba Amos Wilson is saying here, and others he's quoting from, it's essentially another government, completely unaccountable to the public. So we could talk about the devaluation, the money printing that's been taking place through the last, the virus. But I'll carry on with the reading now. So we're on page 300, the tyranny of the free market. The tyranny of the free market. Thus, we can surmise from our foregoing discussion that relative to the most vital areas of life, the making of a living through stable employment and the maintenance of a viable, stable economy, the social and economic fate of Americans rests in private hands and reflects predominantly the policies of a private government, the government of the white male financial corporate elite. This barely visible government not only rules in the shadow of the public government, but more perniciously rules in the name of the free market, of free trade, two phrases most American citizens think are synonymous with individual freedom, freedom of choice, and democracy. However, free market and free trade economies may operationally represent political, social, and economic tyranny, as well as provide the foundations for class and racial domination. The free market or the open market is ultimately owned by those who buy and sell within it. The market consists of human beings engaged. I'm going to bookmark this. This is a very important point. We talked about this in one of the previous chapters, where it's really important to demystify what economy means. The economy. What is the economy? Sometimes you can think of people talk about the economy as if it's like almost like, I don't know, like it's a layer of the Earth's atmosphere that's just there. Oh, the economy. Look, the economy is up there. The economy needs this. The economy needs that. As if it's this entity that just exists apart from humans, and it's just there, and it's the economy, like the atmosphere. Really important to situate this economy in actual human beings and social relations. The market consists of human beings engaged in the varied activities of buying and selling properties, commodities, futures, and a swapping of options. The market is human activity and is therefore biased by human attitudes and values. The nature and effects of markets on the lives of ordinary citizens is determined by the marketing activities of their biggest and most influential buyers and sellers, brokers and dealers. And when those buyers and sellers, brokers and dealers who dominate the markets belong primarily to one class or two races, free markets are not free and open markets are closed. The oligopolistic character of the contemporary free market clearly corroborates John Kenneth Galbraith's contention that the primary objective of the modern giant corporation is to avoid the unpredictability, instability, and riskiness of a marketplace free-for-all. Exactly. The corporate elite's drive to maintain marketplace predictability, stability, to avoid or minimize marketplace risk has led to the situation where, as described by Greenberg, this is Edward Greenberg, quote, giant corporations have amassed sufficient power to allow them, in general, to tame and transcend dealings in the marketplace. Instead of the market system envisioned by Adam Smith, a system characterized by vigorous competition between many small firms, a new system has emerged on the American scene, one the economists term oligopoly. Oligopoly leads to the private control of prices and profits, and thus wide discretion in the decision-making power of corporate executives. Oligopolistic power means that a few firms are able to control the marketplace, to deny entry to new firms, to control sources of raw materials, and to generate their own internal sources of capital for investment and expansion. If one or two racial groups and one class of capitalists dominate capital and other important markets through their or its monopolistic or oligopolistic ownership and control of the means of production, then the establishment and expansion of such markets represent the establishment and expansion of race and class tyrannies over non-market or peripheral market participants. Consequently, the ideological call for free markets and free trade may be in reality a call for racist and for nationalistic economic and military hegemony. Under such circumstances, the free market may provide the rationale and means by which one race or class economically and politically dominates and exploits other races and classes. We argue that such is the case relative to the domination of the global economy and of the lesser developed nations by the American European communities, in collusion with some members of the Asian community, via privately owned and controlled national and international financial corporate agencies. A relatively small group of ethnically homogeneous men and nations seek to privately dominate and exploit the economic and human resources of the universe, wow, for their own national, ethnic, social, and individual benefit at the expense of the vast majority of the world's peoples. We're on page 302 now. So that's a very interesting point he made there, that these big corporations will do anything to avoid the messiness and the unpredictability of actual open markets, free trade, free markets. They don't want that. That's why they keep buying each other up. That's why they swallow up competitors. That's why they do everything they can to set policies so that they, banks become too big to fail. Corporations become too big to fail. They get bailed out. Do we still remember the Great Recession and then how those banks were bailed out? At the cost of billions to ordinary people. But they use this free market, free trade kind of these buzzwords to hoodwink many people who should know better. And so what we're reading about here is how these... and then the second point he's making there is that these so-called free markets that we're talking about here, these markets and economies are dominated, actually, they're all about people. They're people buying and selling between one another, various different things. And the people who dominate and control that buying and selling tend to be people of a particular class and also generally of a particular ethnic group, one or two particular ethnic groups. So back to 302. Ideological evidence for our concern here is provided by an article published by Benjamin C. Schwartz, foreign policy analyst at the Rand Corporation. And I think that's the Koch brothers entity, the Rand Corporation. I used to think it was connected to Ayn Rand, but I don't think it is. Although it might be. Published in the May 1994 issue of Salmagundi and adapted for the opinion op-ed section of the New York Times, May 23rd, 1994. In the op-ed column entitled, "Is Capitalism Doomed?" Schwartz makes the following assertions and proposals. So big long quote here. Today's global economy depends on American power. We've heard that before. In fact, international capitalism has enjoyed only two golden ages, the periods following the Napoleonic Wars and the two World Wars. The key to both these episodes of peace and prosperity is the fact that they came after war, is he going to say? Has been the same, the ability and will of a single state to become a hegemonic power, taking over the security problems of weaker states so they need not pursue autarkic policies nor form trading blocs to improve their international positions. This suspension of the power politics through hegemony has been the fundamental aim of American foreign policy since 1945. Even though the Cold War has ended, and there we are, the Cold War's back now, really is back, and there's three players now. Back then there was only two, and I remember this very clearly in the 90s, like the narrative of it's all over, the Cold War's finished, capitalism's won, democracy's won, everyone's just going to be free now, hooray! That didn't turn out so well, did it? Even though the Cold War has ended, America's security leadership, for instance, its domination of NATO and the alliance with Japan, is still necessary to hold in check the rivalries that would otherwise disrupt the stability that a global economy requires. Thus, the United States must continue, as the Pentagon's 1992 draft defense planning guidance argues, to dominate the international system by discouraging the advanced industrial nations from challenging our leadership or even aspiring to a larger global or regional role. And boy, China came like a bull in a china shop, didn't it? Bull in the china shop. China came like a bull in a china shop. I wonder if that term's racist, bull in the china shop. No, it's not. China is the crockery and stuff. So China came and unsettled, just ripped up the rule book, said, nope, we're not just going to be one of your vassal states just doing your bidding. And then Russia has kind of followed suit as well, hasn't it? Where was I? Yeah. Assuming this awesome responsibility, the Pentagon asserts, ensures a market-oriented zone of peace and prosperity that encompasses more than 2/3 of the world's economy. Imposing a protectorate over two-thirds of the world economy means not only that the United States must dominate wealthy and technologically sophisticated friendly states, but that it must also deal with such nuisances as Saddam Hussein, Kim Il-sung, and Slobodan Milosevic, so that potential great powers need not acquire the means to deal with these problems themselves. This in turn dictates that America must spend more on national security than the rest of the world combined. The indispensable foundation for integration among the advanced industrialized nations was and remains American hegemony. To hold that US hegemony is no longer needed because the political, economic, and military cooperation among the great powers now ensures stability and peace is to put the cart before the horse. Most everyone applauds the highest stage of capitalism, today's complex web of global trade, production, and finance, as the dawn of a brave new world. But a genuinely interdependent economy is extraordinarily fragile. Today, the emergent high technology industries, for instance, are the most powerful engines of world economic growth, but they require a level of specialization and a breadth of markets that is possible only in an integrated world economy. It is difficult to see, therefore, how capitalism can survive the decline of Pax America. Interesting. So it's kind of like capitalism is beautiful. Capitalism is doing great because of America's military might. And America is able to go and do all the fighting and putting out all these fires like Saddam and Milosevic and Kim Il-sung, because America is able to do that and to kind of basically look after, be the leader of two-thirds of the world. That's why you can have all this wonderful progress and this brave new world of capitalist order. And so the idea is that if America falls and America is no longer able to be the global policeman, then capitalism must also fall as well. So there you go. You know what to do. Anyway, so here we have it in blunt, plain English. White American, Western European, Japanese, and perhaps Southeast Asian economic prosperity and capitalisms depend on the existence of a market-oriented zone that encompasses more than two-thirds of the world's economy, protected by the military and economic hegemony of the United States. There can be little doubt that African peoples, both inside and outside the United States, are expected to largely compose the one-third of the world's economy not included in the zone of peace and prosperity. Although not so much these days, actually. The United States is very concerned with Africa these days, much more obviously these days. You've got AFRICOM and, they're going out there constantly. I'm constantly seeing videos of some American military advisors or ambassadors going to Ghana or Uganda or wherever it might be, just there pontificating, and Nigeria, going there, and because Africa is extremely important strategically, critical to the global capitalist order. I mean, just on a basic level, if you've got some revolutionary government taken over in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, and they started to actually demand a fair price for their, the coltan, cobalt, copper, and whatnot, all these minerals that are used to fuel these gadgets of ours, the global economy would be overturned overnight. There'd be a cataclysm. It would be like something on the lines of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, was it? When all the OPEC states kind of, used their power over oil to basically hike up prices and whatnot. It'll be something like that. That plunged the US and other Western countries into years of economic stagnation. So, but no, they're definitely interested in Africa these days. In support of his argument, Schwartz refers to the February 18, 1992 draft of the Pentagon's Defense Planning Guidance for the fiscal years 1994 to 1999. And this draft, which outlined ways to thwart challenges to the primacy of America, and which proposes to maintain a one superpower world, is in part described by the New York Times. In a broad new policy statement that is in its final drafting stage, the Defense Department asserts that America's political and military mission in the post-war era will be to ensure that no rival superpower is allowed to emerge in Western Europe, Asia, or the territory of the former Soviet Union, and how they must be so annoyed with the likes of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, who just, and their people who just refuse. Nope. These China and Russia, like, people need to understand, China and Russia are not some new little countries that were just formed a couple of hundred years ago, like the United States was. China and Russia are ancient countries, especially China, ancient civilizations going back thousands of years in China's case. And they have spent, China in particular, has spent more of its existence as a dominant power in this region and in the world than it has spent being a vassal of someone else, like the Japanese for a while. Same with Russia as well. Russia, when I grew up, Russia, this is in the Cold War was still happening when I was very young, and there was kind of like this. Russia was painted as these, like, everything was dark, everything was black and white, very dour, and the Russians were just painted as like these crazy, lunatic, power hungry. Do you remember Dolph Lundgren's character in Rocky IV? Like this, he's almost like a machine. I Russia, I will kill and break you. All that sort of stuff. Really caricature the Russians as just being crazy, evil people. But you look at Russia's history, meet Russian people, and you'll soon find out that no, this is a very ancient people, very great nation, and they're not here to mess about. They're not here to be the subservience to the United States. For goodness sake, these people talking about World War II and America, this, that, and the other. There's a very strong argument to be made that this would be a very different world if it wasn't for the Soviets. It wasn't for the Russians and Ukrainians and whatnot. If it wasn't for them in the 1939 to 45 war, Britain and America probably wouldn't have won that war, and it would be a completely different world now. And the Russians are not going to just sit back. The Chinese and the Russians are not just going to sit back and become vassals of the United States. They've had enough suffering in their history, particularly the Chinese, over the last 150 years at the hands of Japan. They've had enough suffering and enough humiliation, like the Opium Wars, where I don't know if you know, but Britain in the 17 or 1800s basically went to war with China because Britain was selling opium, heroin, you could loosely call it, to the Chinese people, and the Chinese rulers didn't want that to happen anymore. So Britain went to war to force them to enable them to shot their drugs to the Chinese people to keep them, walking around like zombies. And they won. Britain won that opium war. And so they carried on selling these drugs. And then Japan comes along a bit later and takes over huge chunks of China, Manchuria and that sort of stuff, rapes and pillages, so many of their people and stuff like that for years and years and years, maybe decades. And then there's the Civil War, in China, the Chinese Civil War, which Mao and his crew kind of, fought and eventually won. And then since that point in 1949, China has been quietly building itself back up to be an undisputed heavyweight amongst heavyweights in the world. So what was my point in all this? I can't remember what my point was, but basically, China and Russia are, and that's what I was saying. Yeah, sorry. These people that we're reading about, these American geopolitical people, they're deluded if they think that China, Russia, and any other, large. I mean, you can even maybe mention Iran in that. Iran is another big ancient civilization, massive country, huge amounts of people in there. These people are not going to just kowtow, bow down, and worship at the altar of Americans, hegemony. And frankly, it's about time that Africa joined in. If we could get ourselves unified more and start to speak with a more unified voice, we also need to be amongst these, these discontents who are just saying, no, shut up, America and Britain and the West. Be quiet. You will no longer dominate us. Hopefully by the time my children become, in their grown-ups, hopefully by that stage Africa will have taken a a seat at the table a bit more than what it has at the moment. But yes, so this quote from this person is this quote from this document is saying, America must never let any other power basically emerge anywhere, even Western Europe. And sorry, one more thing as well. I'm talking about Russia and China. The European Union, one of the things you need to understand about the European Union, particularly since Brexit or around that time, is that their aim is precisely to become one of the global players alongside the United States, Russia, China, and so forth. And I mentioned this quite often, but when Brexit happened, there was a guy called Guy Verhofstadt, who was a Belgian Eurocrat. And he was coming out saying, listen, good, we've got rid of Britain. They can sod off now. Get out. They're just slowing us down. Now we can create our army. Now we can create our military, strength, because Russia is over there and Russia has eyes on our stuff. And we need to basically, be ready to defend ourselves against Russia. So even the European Union is basically developing into something that's going to become a world power. And obviously America doesn't want that to happen. Living in Britain is always weird because we're like literally half an hour away from Europe, mainland Europe. But culturally, we are even closer to the United States. So it's like, they're always in this weird in-between position where, Europe's just there, but then America is basically our child, and our child who's become stronger than us, but so we must stay with them. It's a funny situation. But anyway, let's get back to this one. So a 46-page document that has been circulating at the highest levels of the Pentagon for weeks, and which Defense Secretary Dick Cheney expects to be released later this month, states that part of the American mission will be convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests. So yeah, next section here, page 303, got a couple more pages left. It's called The Policy of Deterrence. The classified document makes the case for a world dominated by one superpower whose position can be perpetuated by constructive behavior and sufficient military might to deter any nation or group of nations from challenging American primacy. Page 304. To perpetuate this role, the United States must sufficiently account for the interests of the advanced industrial nations to discourage them from challenging our leadership or seeking to overturn the established political and economic order, the document states. With its focus on this concept of benevolent domination by one power, the Pentagon document articulates the clearest rejection to date of collective internationalism, the strategy that emerged from World War II when the 5 victorious powers sought to form a United Nations that would mediate disputes and police outbreaks of violence. And then, okay, so following are excerpts from the Pentagon's February 18 draft of the Defense Planning Guidance for the fiscal years 94 to 99. This defense planning guidance addresses the fundamentally new situation which has been created by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the disintegration of the internal as well as the external empire, and discrediting of communism as an ideology with global pretensions and influence. The new international environment has also been shaped by the victory of the United States and its coalition allies over Iraqi aggression, the first post-Cold War conflict, and a defining event in US global leadership. It's weird that they said the first post-Cold War conflict. Okay, yeah, I get it. And a defining event in global US leadership. In addition to these two victories, there has been a less visible one: the integration of Germany and Japan into a US-led system of collective security and the creation of a democratic zone of peace. Our first objective is to prevent the re-emergence of a new rival, either on the territory of the former Soviet Union or elsewhere, that poses a threat on the order of that posed formerly by the Soviet Union. This is a dominant consideration underlying the new regional defense strategy and requires that we endeavor to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate world power. This is great. These regions include Western Europe, East Asia, the territory of the former Soviet Union, and Southwest Asia, which is what we call the Middle East, Iraq, the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Peninsula. And that's where you understand why Israel was so important, because Israel's the America's man in the Southwest Asia. There are three additional aspects to this objective. First, the United States must show the leadership necessary to establish and protect a new order that helps the promise of convincing potential competitors that they need not aspire to a greater role or pursue a more aggressive posture to protect their legitimate interests. Second, in the non-defense areas, we must account sufficiently for the interests of the advanced industrial countries to discourage them from challenging our leadership or seeking to overturn the established political and economic order. Finally, we must maintain the mechanisms for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. An effective reconstitution capability is important here, since it implies that a potential rival could not hope to quickly or easily gain a prominent military position in the world. The second objective is to address sources of regional conflict and instability in such a way as to promote increasing respect for international law, limit international violence, and encourage the spread of democratic forms of government and open economic systems. And just be clear, when these kinds of documents and people are talking about democratic forms of government, they're not talking about power to the people. Just be clear on that. They're talking about replicating what they've got in the United States, i.e. corporatocracy, corporate rule, with a democratic veneer. They want to replicate that around the world. Never get it twisted when these people are talking about democracy, when Biden or Bush or Obama or Trump, for that matter, Blair, when they're talking about, democracy is about defending democracy, they're not talking about the people power. Yeah. These objectives are especially important in deterring conflicts or threats in regions of security importance to the United States because of their proximity, such as Latin America, or where we have treaty obligations or security commitments to other nations. While the US cannot become the world's policeman, by assuming responsibility for righting every wrong, we will retain the preeminent responsibility for addressing selectively those wrongs which threaten not only our interests, but those of our allies and friends, or which would seriously unsettle international relations. Various types of US interests may be involved in such instances. Access to vital raw materials, primarily Persian Gulf oil. Proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles. Threats to United States citizens from terrorism and regional or local conflict, and threats to United States society from narcotics trafficking, which is ironic because the United States government, it's been said, is the biggest drug dealer in the world. For example, I'll give you two examples. One, the Iran-Contra affair and what's the guy's name? Freeway Rick Ross, and how the US government, CIA, was most likely selling drugs in the ghettos of America, selling drugs in black inner city areas in America to A, dumb down and pacify the blacks in America, but B, get money to pay the rebels in, was it Nicaragua? To make sure that was it the Sandinistas or some left-wing government wouldn't survive, so drug dealing. And then the second one as well is Afghanistan. Opium production, heroin production. Afghanistan is probably the world leader in poppy production, heroin production. But then when the Taliban took over in whenever it was, 2000, late 90s, or whenever it was, late 90s, anyway, the opium production dropped off a cliff and remained there. No heroin coming out of Afghanistan. And then the Americans went in there and brought democracy to Afghanistan in 2003 or 4. And guess what happened? The taps were turned on. the drugs, i.e. the money, started pouring again. And I presume now that the Taliban have taken back over again in Afghanistan, probably it's the same picture that the opium, production has gone down. So I don't know. I ain't saying that they're a drug dealer, but they ain't messing with. No, I don't know. But the point I'm saying is that, sorry, the point I'm making is that it's funny that these people are talking about. They're talking about terrorism. They're talking about narcotics traveling. They're talking, and as if they're opposed to these things. For goodness sake, America has been the chief architect of terrorism around the world for many, many decades, in many, many different parts of the world. Then the last bit of quote from this paper, this defense planning guidance, says, with the demise of global military threat to US interests. Do you remember that? I remember that. I remember when the narrative was that, oh, we have no more threats now. We are the big daddy. We rule. America and Britain, tagging along. We rule the world. Yay, there's no more threats. It's like Alexander of Macedon. He allegedly, when he took over Persia, went into kind of the Afghanistan, India region, and then they got to some river, and he was supposed to have wept because there was nowhere left to conquer. It's funny, something about these, these guys that just, so power hungry. And fair enough, it makes sense. But it's funny that they're saying, yeah, there's no more threats. We are the big daddy. So with the demise of global military threat to US interests, regional military threats, including possible conflicts arising in and from the territory of the former Soviet Union, will be of primary concern to the US in the future. These threats are likely to arise in regions critical to the security of the United States and its allies, including Europe, East Asia, the Middle East, and Southwest Asia, and the territory of the former Soviet Union. We also have important interests at stake in Latin America, Oceania, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Oh, there we go. In both cases, the United States will be concerned with preventing the domination of key regions by a hostile power, unquote. All right, well, that was a big quote, wasn't it? So last little section for this chapter then, this session, is called Pax Americana and Pan-African Prosperity. This is page 305 going into 306. The Pax Americana on which world capitalism and free enterprise presumably depends, according to the Pentagon draft, obviously requires United States and white American financial corporate elites global political, economic, and military hegemony. As the draft recognizes, such hegemony can only be challenged by national, regional, or collective blocks of peoples determined to maintain their relative autonomy and ability to be the prime beneficiaries of their own human and material resources. So that's what America, these people don't want. They do not want people who have got control over their own lives as nations, as blocks of peoples, and we can't have people groups coming together, forming alliances. They just can't have that, because that is what will damage American hegemony. If African nations and peoples are to be salvaged from the impoverished third of the world's economy under the aegis of United States economic and military hegemony, then it is vitally necessary for the African American nation to be deeply and inextricably intertwined in the American industrial military complex. This means that the African American community must deeply penetrate and co-own the mainstream American financial corporate sector, and through its influence on American foreign policy, move to direct that policy in ways favorable to the security and prosperity of all African nations and peoples. Oh, that's interesting. So he's saying that if we as Africans, individuals and nations around the world are going to be free from this hegemony, African Americans must deeply embed itself in the military industrial complex. And so they must deeply penetrate this American financial corporate sector and then put pressure on American foreign policy to move that policy in ways favorable to the security and prosperity of all African nations and peoples. It also means that African nations and peoples, including the African American community, must, with urgent care, develop a global cooperative corporate system in order to counterbalance white American, European, and Asian systems, which are now taking exploitative advantage of the currently weak and disorganized state of these same nations and peoples. The power of national and transnational governments, corporations rather, must be counterbalanced by organized national and transnational consumer unions, which will operate against our socio-cultural and political economic interests. Operate against their social, cultural, and political economic interests. In their counteractions against hegemonic financial corporate capital, organized consumers must be joined by national and international organized labor, which refuses to accept wage slavery and peonage as conditions for being employed by piggish transnational corporations. And the last sentence, although strategically passive and active resistance on the part of the organized masses of the world over can overcome the tyranny of the only strategically passive and active resistance on the part of the organized masses of the world can overcome the tyranny of the international financial corporate elite if it is their will to do so. Okay, so that was a good chapter there. Kind of, we've been talking a lot about America in these last few chapters, focusing very specifically on the specific dynamics of the American system. So this is a good chapter in that we broadened the horizons once again, and we looked at the global system, and we looked at how America is very keen to shape the world in the image that it has in mind. And as I was saying, the situation on the ground has changed over the last 25 years with the rise of belligerents to American hegemonic power, such as China and Russia, Iran to a lesser degree. And yeah, I found it. I mean, he said there at the end there that the way to free Africans from this is to embed Africans, to get really deeply embedded into this, basically the power elite in America, which I'm not sure I get that point, to be honest. Maybe that's something that he will kind of clarify in future sessions. But yeah, that's it. That's been chapter 13 of Blueprint for Black Power by Baba Amos Wilson. Thank you guys for watching. I know there's a few of you online watching live, so peace and blessings to each and every single one of you. We'll have a new Pan-African Science podcast uploaded on Monday, and the subject of that podcast will be ultraviolet light, and how ultraviolet light is good for us as Black people, because we have a lot of this melanin stuff in our hair and our eyes. So look out for that Monday morning UK time, very early Monday morning US time. But for now, I want to wish you peace and blessings. Take care. Get out in the sunshine. I know it's sunny here in the UK. I'm about to go back outside again. You guys get outside in the sun as well, wherever you are in the world. Take care. Stay well. Be blessed. And I'll see you next time. Salama. Peace.